Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre. Hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode we discuss the horror genre, from books to film to TV and beyond. Sometimes even from the beyond. You can find us online at terrorintandem.com and on Instagram at terrorintandem.
Hi.
Hello.
It's me. It's us.
Oh boy. Every time.
That was me. I was just describing me. But it's us.
It is us.
Hi. This is my favorite time of the week.
Hello to our new listeners.
Yay.
Welcome. Also, I just want to say we should do an international episode on German horror because we have quite a few Germany listeners.
That's amazing, and I would love to because there are some phenomenal entries in that category.
Well, they have definitely
I'm already
generational trauma. Being German, so I'm sure they have a lot of ways to express
They're also
the horrors of the German experience.
The German artists and filmmakers are some of the earliest pioneers of the horror genre. The great F.W. Murnau,
yeah, so great.
Nosferatu and all that. So I would love to do that. I have so many ideas.
Well, this is not that
Das
episode.
ist good. No, this is not. This is kein that episode.
Oh,
That's
boy.
about as much German as I know.
Yeah. Again, this is not about Germany. But this is about sequels.
Hello. Sequels. What do we mean when we say sequels?
Well, I think everybody has a concept of what a sequel is.
Yeah.
I think even some of the best directors think they have a concept of what a sequel is, however, not necessarily executed.
Well, that's
I
the
would
thing.
like to argue that The Dark Knight is one of the best sequels out there.
Yes.
That surpasses the original.
Well, that's the thing, beloved co-host, is...
And I could also argue that The Dark Knight is a horror film. I know it's not. But I could argue the point that it has elements of horror.
And sponsors of our non-existent Patreon can enjoy that fake bonus episode eventually.
When I make a case for The Dark Knight being in the horror genre.
I think you could. I'd love to hear a critical reading of that from beloved co-host. Our sound engineer, ladies and gents, is currently scratching their face.
She's very distracted.
Scratching her face on a wicker basket.
The fruit basket. Not that fruit basket.
I wish that had been phrased differently.
I know. She is really rubbing her face up against the wicker man over here.
I'm rubbing your face against crackly wicker. You're supposed to be the sound engineer. You should know.
It's interesting because she's never done this ever, and
No.
she chooses now to do it.
Yeah.
She's really, really interested in
I
this.
think cats...
I've never seen her do that circular scratching.
I think cats have an innate sense of when you're busy.
You just gave away that our sound engineer is our cat.
I outed her
Yeah.
as a cat. I think it's been stated before. Wow, you're really tickled.
Well, because she's looking, I could just see her eyes peeking over the counter.
That is not the role of a sound engineer.
I'm sorry, everyone. We just got really distracted. But sequels.
Sequels.
We're going to do a sequel to our intro, which is a continuation of the story.
Well, honestly, you did start to raise a really good point. Is a sequel is a tricky thing. It is not easy to do successfully, and it's such a rare thing for the sequel to surpass the original that you specifically called it out in your example. And I can really only think of maybe a handful of sequels that I would consider to be the equal to or better than the original.
And I think we're not going to really talk about if we think the sequel is better than the original. I think when we are going to go through some sequels, it's going to be our favorites and why. But I will say that a successful sequel is really the continuation. It is often made mistakenly as telling the same story again?
Well, why don't we break it down? Why don't we do it one at
Okay.
a time? We'll talk about what makes a successful sequel, and then we can talk about some of the pitfalls
Okay.
of
Go
sequels.
for it.
So you mentioned your first point. What makes a successful sequel?
Yep.
It's a continuation.
Correct.
You're building on something that worked the first time around. So really,
And I would argue that's the biggest failure of non-successful sequels.
oh, absolutely. Now, what makes a successful sequel in that term is you are taking what came. It's a bit of a balancing act because you are taking with reverence a film that was ostensibly successful and well received enough to get a sequel in the first place, so it's got fans. You're taking what worked with that and you're expanding on it without retreading the exact same story over again, just with more explosions.
Yeah.
So, some really, really good examples of that are, well, actually, we're going to talk about some examples of that later. I don't want to jump into that too quick. I got a bit ahead of myself. I sequelized my own movie before the original was over.
Yeah.
But yeah, it builds, it doesn't erase. A bad sequel, the opposite end of that coin, would be something that completely ignores the original, almost in a disdainful way.
Or just showing the same characters acting the same ways,
Oh,
but
yeah.
in a different setting.
That's
or a
boring as
different
shit.
story. I mean, you want to see growth of character.
Yes.
You want to see a change or a movement in the experiential relationship between the characters from the original. Or the absence of, because one of my sequels that I'm going to talk about actually is a sequel, and it's a reflection of the absence of one of the primary characters from the original.
Yes. This is a little bit of a side note. This is why growing up, I never really I didn't watch a lot of TV because I hated that.
Because you didn't own a TV?
No, I hated the fact that there never seemed to be any stakes. That even in the, as advertised, a very special episode where like a major character would die, by the next week, it was back to normal. They could have a special event episode to boost their ratings during sweeps week, but it never mattered. And it really wasn't until more serialized storytelling became vogue, like after Buffy in the late 90s, early 2000s, that characters would go through something and then the effect of that would be reflected throughout the rest of the show.
Well, let's take that a little bit. Previous television history, not as many sequels took place as much as like a next season. But if the story ended or that original series ended, there would be a like a reboot. What is that called?
A spinoff?
Spinoff.
Oh, yeah. Tons of spinoffs.
Which isn't a sequel.
No, it's just, that's more like just capitalizing on familiar property. It's taking a built-in audience with you. And
or if there's a story to tell about characters that have not had the spotlight in the original iteration, maybe that's a way to go.
Yeah.
But if anybody's ever finished a book or finished a TV show or movie and said, I really wonder what they're up to now, that's really where a good sequel can jump in.
Yes.
And expose and share
Have you created
what they're up to now.
That brings me to, I think, one of the greatest requirements of a sequel is it necessary? Does it need to exist? I mean, have you ever gotten to the end of a movie and just been like, I really hope they don't make a sequel to this?
Yes.
Some stories are only as strong as they are because they are finite. It's like the old adage that life is precious because it ends, not because it's infinite.
Honestly, and the reason I feel that way is because so many sequels don't live up to and put a pall on the original.
Also, I came up especially during the bad old days of the 90s, which was just like sequel after sequel after sequel, and they were mostly just quick cash grabs or attempts by the studio to keep the rights from reverting back to the creator. Looking at you, Dimension and Hellraiser. That has since been rectified, and we got a pretty decent reboot last year and an upcoming show. So excited about
Absolutely.
that. But is the sequel necessary? Did the first movie leave you wanting more? Now, I want to be a little careful with this rule, because while it is an important rule, it's not exactly ironclad. We have an example this year with The Wrath of Becky, which is a movie that I would argue nobody saw coming. The original movie really didn't warrant a sequel, didn't seem like there was going to be one, and yet The Wrath of Becky exists and in almost every way is better than the original. It feels more like a second attempt at the story the way they really wanted to do it, more than a sequel. But it does build on the character of Becky, and it does take place with the first movie's events having happened, so it is a sequel. But it's pretty easy, I think, for people to identify like a cynical studio cash grab versus an organic story. You know, like Stephen King likes to say he lets his characters tell their story to him. Mm-hmm. I think we can all tell when a movie comes out and it feels like a continuation of the story. Like Blade Runner 2049 was a really great continuation of the story many decades later. But I think a lot of the criticism you're seeing out of the current MCU is most of these movies don't feel like their own movies anymore. They feel like setups to the next movie. You know, I just watched a 2.5-hour effects-heavy commercial for the movie that's coming out 2 years from now. You know, and it leaves you with that feeling of like...
Commercial?
Well, I'm saying like these movies sometimes feel like just very long advertisements for the next movie to come out.
Yeah.
Like the recent Ant-Man was like, all right, so this is just all set up for whatever Kang is going to do. Anyway, sorry to side note a little bit, but is the sequel necessary? Do you need to make it, or did you just see the returns from the first movie and decide, hey, let's fucking slap another one together?
Yeah, if you're trying to tell the same story, again, in like a different setting or with different problems, that's not a sequel.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes there's that an interesting thing you see a lot in books. You'll see a retread of the same story from a different character's perspective. Orson Scott Card did it. John Scalzi did it in a couple of his books. I know I'm mentioning just sci-fi stuff, but it's interesting because you know the plot, but you're getting a completely different perspective. Mm-hmm. And that is sometimes, if that's different enough, it can be worth revisiting a story, the ending of which you already kind of know. So another sequel do and don't has to do, I think, with the relationship with the audience. You want to listen and respect the audience, meaning if the audience really likes elements of the first film, don't completely get rid of them. Looking at you, Highlander 2, The Quickening. My God, maybe the worst sequel of all time. But don't dismiss it. Then again, understand that you are the storyteller. This is your story that you're telling. You don't need to cow to every audience demand. A movie made entirely of fan service only pisses everyone off. That's all it ever does. No one's ever happy with that. It's shallow. It just feels like things are shoehorned in to make people, you know, nostalgic, which is not necessarily a good feeling. But, you know, you kind of want to strike that balance, and we'll get into it in our examples of being faithful to the original while still telling something that is different enough to justify the existence of a new movie. Mm-hmm. How about you? Do you have any elements to what you think make a successful sequel?
I also think that continuity of participation behind the scenes.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big deal.
Honestly, I'm not saying you can't have a successful sequel with new people, but there's a lot to consider. And one of the examples that I'm going to share has all new people because the sequel takes place, I don't know, 40 plus years after the original. So most of those folks have been gone, but the originator of the story is the connective tissue. And the fact that, this was a book to film in both circumstances, the writer and author of the book, both books, is the key to this puzzle. I think that element needs to be there in order to have a chance.
I agree.
Have the best chance at a successful sequel.
Some of the examples I'm going to talk about have a common thread of original creators returning to the franchise because, well,
there's still a story to be told.
Yeah,
and
you'll see sometimes like a direct sequel, the original people don't return, and it's even if it's done by good and well-meaning people, it understandably has a different flavor because they are different people. So that might be something in a second movie that audiences really aren't ready for, but by like a fourth or fifth movie, they're totally ready for new blood, new perspective, a shift in,
Well, if you look at Candyman,
Yes.
that's not a sequel.
But it is.
Well, it's a remake.
It's a requel. I don't know. Yeah.
Requel, because
it's sort of a
all
new
new
thing.
people. The only continuity is the actual evil entity, which is why I don't.
And the character of Abdul Yahya Mateen, he's the child from the first movie, and his mother's in it.
Yep. But it's really Candyman's continuity.
Oh yeah, but it is a sequel in that it references heavily the original. It has characters from the original, but there's only one real. Bernard Rose doesn't return to direct. It's Nia DaCosta writing and directing the sequel. But I hear you. I would argue that the continuity...
Requel is a better term for that.
The continuity in behind-the-scenes talent is more important in early sequel installments because you want to keep the story going, and it's always best to have the same people have it plotted out. But in later installments, it might benefit, and often does, to introduce a new slate of creators to the latter Scream movies are amazing. That's a totally new group of people making it.
Yeah. And I know that they're in order, they're like Scream.
Yeah, but this is like its
order,
own
but it is. It's
trilogy.
A total reboot.
Yeah. Well, it's not a total reboot because it's got, Gale is a major character in the 5th and 6th movies.
Yeah.
Dewey is Dewey in the 5th one? He's in the 4th one. Sorry. Oh, Dewey. You did your best. It wasn't great, but it was your best.
Scream 6 was the latest.
Yeah, and Gale was in it.
Scream 5.
He was in Scream 5? Is that the one where he bought it?
Spoiler alert.
Ah, sorry, Mr. Arquette. Speaking of Arquettes, no, not yet.
Okay. That's fine.
Not yet, Arquette. Well, I would...
You're going to have to cut all that garbage out.
I know.
Cut.
So, we talked a little bit about what makes a sequel, in our opinion, work. There are a couple of pitfalls. We've mentioned some. Now, one that I really, really want to mention, there is the old adage that a sequel has to be bigger to be better. I don't think that's true. If it serves the story, sure. And that's really the only thing that anyone should ever be concerned about is, does this serve the story? Not, look at me, I've got more money, I can have more pyrotechnics this time around.
I mean, I think as the creators behind any film, and as you're approaching the desire to make a sequel, do you want to continue to tell this story, or are you capitalizing? And that's part of the point you made earlier. Like, what is the intention behind the sequel?
There are some stories...
Is it just to make money, or is it a continuation of the story? And I think that's where we see the distinction between what a successful sequel is and what is just
I'm just saying
sequel.
It doesn't always mean better. Now, one of the examples I'm going to give later is a movie that expands... on the original, it makes it bigger in every single possible way. So sometimes it does mean better. I just say that sometimes you can keep the scope small and intimate and tell a very successful story. You don't need to spend all the money on big new set pieces.
Yeah, like Speed 2 is a great example of
trying
to make
Speed
it
2
bigger.
Cruise Control.
Yeah, trying to make it bigger.
Yeah.
And like, but they're just adapting a model to
It was literally
system that doesn't
we're replacing
exist.
a bus with a cruise ship.
what would have
And
worked
Jason
better.
Patrick instead of
know.
Keanu Reeves, that's an odd choice.
Well, because they told you why. It was like, oh yeah, we dated and it didn't work out. But honestly, what they should have done is have the original villain get out of jail.
Wasn't it Willem Dafoe in the sequel?
I-
He had like leeches
yeah.
on him. Oh man,
But
that
the
movie's
original
so
villain should
bad.
have come back and
Yeah.
has like kidnapped
Wait, Dennis
Sandra
Hopper?
Bullock's
He got
character.
decapitated in the first movie.
or like his son or
Okay,
something.
yeah,
like,
that
you know what
makes
I'm
sense.
saying?
Yeah, like his
this is
pissed
what I'm
off
saying.
incel
That is
son.
the continuation, not taking Sandra Bullock's character,
Yeah.
moving her to a big ship and
With a
having the
different
same thing
boyfriend.
happen again.
No, it was like Die Hard 2 and Die Hard 3
Correct.
and Die Hard 4 and 5. You know, it's like the same schmo just getting like stuck in world-ending situations. Like, what is your luck, man?
And listen, I'll watch these, but I'm
Yeah.
not going to say that these are successful sequels.
We're not doing episodes on them. But a sequel is also, and as we've mentioned, it's tricky, but it is a chance to experiment a little bit. And boy, every single time I will take a swing and a miss over a safe retread. I love a sequel. There's a place in my heart for a sequel that doesn't quite hit, but really went for it.
Mm-hmm.
I would much rather that than just a paint by numbers safety movie to just pad some wallets that are already pretty fat. So it's a good chance to take what came before, you know, like what Sam Raimi did with Evil Dead. It's a small, intimate first film. And then with the second movie, it's a straight up horror comedy. By the third movie, he's time traveling to the Middle Ages. And now it's, you know, a total franchise. Video games, comics, movies, TV shows, reboots, more reboots.
I also think, you know, the intention behind storytelling itself. So if you look at the Indian Lake trilogy by Stephen Graham Jones, you know, the first book, My Heart is a Chainsaw, is followed up by a second book, Don't Fear the Reaper, and there is going to be a third. So the Don't Fear the Reaper is a sequel, and it will determine the potential success of the third installation. And I think we see that a lot. If there is an intention to tell a story, that you can end it at a sequel or you can continue it on. And so that's also going to determine what the next phase is, especially in movie making. You know, if a certain sequel wasn't as successful or bombed, chances are maybe the third installment is either not going to be made or is going to be shelved or is going to have a quiet release or might not be successful at all.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a little break?
Okay.
And then we can hop into some of our favorites and suggestions for some dope-ass sequels.
Sounds great.
Getting away with literal murder takes skills. And baby, you've got them. But when it comes to crafting the perfect costume, well, let's just say your talents lie elsewhere. Maybe mommy never taught you to sew before you killed her and stole her face. Maybe you have knives for hands or husky meat paws, perfect for bashing campers, but not so great at threading a needle. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve to look cool. So come on down to Tears of a Clown Makeup and Costume Emporium and treat yourself to the obscene makeover your parents always suspected was hiding just beneath the surface. At Tears of a Clown Makeup and Costume Emporium, we look past your tired flesh suit to bring out the real you. Working together to determine your nightmare-inducing look, our team of sartorial sadists will assist you with all the fittings, measurements, and elective surgeries. So save your creativity for your ironic kill tableaus. From sloppy clown fits to demonic priest and everything in between, we guarantee a look to satisfy the monster within. If you're unhappy with your look, come on back in and we'll straight up kill you. Be sure to ask about our Cenobite special, Get one half of your head riveted with nails, get the other half free. This is a fake ad for a fake product on a horror-themed podcast. Dressing up is cool, hurting people is not. Seriously, I shouldn't have to tell you this. Now we're back.
Okay. So why don't I start with my first sequel?
I'd love it.
My first sequel, not my second sequel.
Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about The Shining and Doctor Sleep. So the sequel being Doctor Sleep. So the novel was published in 2013 by Stephen King.
That long ago? Wow.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And, it obviously The Shining was written by Stephen King as well. And the original was made by Stanley Kubrick in 1980. We've talked a lot about Kubrick and King's opposition to how the book was represented in film. But if you separate that vision that Stephen King had in his novel and the vision that Kubrick laid out on the screen, they can live independently.
It's like watching two people you love have an argument, because the movie is a classic. The novel is a classic.
Yes.
They're both masterpieces. And, it's sad that they didn't get along and Stephen King never warmed up to that version. But the fact remains is, even though the movie diverges from the book in some pretty significant ways, it's still one of the all-time greatest horror movies ever shot.
And one of the greatest horror novels.
And one of the greatest novels ever written. I know. Amazing.
And so what I want to do is sort of reference back to the intentionality and the continuity. So the continuity, obviously, is Stephen King. He wrote both works. And, Dr. Sleep picked up with what happened to Danny Torrance from in his middle age. But what I really want to focus on in this particular sequel is Mike Flanagan.
Okay.
So Mike Flanagan's approach to directing this film was really a sequel to both Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and Stephen King's novel, The Shining. So he simultaneously created a sequel in the film Doctor Sleep to both.
And I don't know if anyone else could have pulled this off.
Well, his intentionality was very specific in his approach. He got King's blessing with his vision, and he was a big fan of The Shining, both the book and the novel. So he was very focused on making sure that he could connect the two.
And he nailed it.
He did nail it. And he really did a faithful adaptation to Doctor Sleep.
And just a shout out to his decision to recast Jack Nicholson instead of computer dead-eye de-aging him. He recast Jack Torrance with his longtime stalwart Henry Thomas.
Yeah.
And that was excellent because Henry Thomas is great. He did a great job playing the character of Jack Torrance, doing sort of a semi-Jack Nicholson. But it's so much better to have a real actor play the role than to watch some creepy, dead-eyed computer simulacrum of a person.
Yeah.
Please recast Hollywood.
Mike Flanagan wanted, like I said, to do a faithful adaptation of the novel because that's where The Shining film had a misstep, at least in Stephen King's opinion.
Yeah.
Stephen King's story is canon. That is the ultimate. And so he wanted to write a sequel.
And the movie, in a very, very big way, does that with the character of Dick Hallorann.
Correct. One of the things that I do want to mention is, Ewan McGregor plays grown-up Danny Torrance and does an amazing job.
Really does. He's such a great actor.
But I think the movie's big win is really Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat.
100%. Oh, man. I want more villainous turns from Rebecca Ferguson. She slays in this movie.
If you think back to The Shining, both the book and the film, there is growth from Stephen King's perspective and from, I don't know, representation of women in both the novel and in the film, and in the novel of Dr. Sleep and the film.
Yes.
So we see the female taking on more of a dynamic and role of strength, leadership.
Yes.
Rather than things happening, she's making things happen.
And like all the best villains, she's an absolute nightmare monster with very understandable motivations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it does take that continuation to another level, and it does tell a contemporary new tale. So it pays, I mean, Stephen King does this really well in the book, but Mike Flanagan pays homage to the original film and novel, but the story is new. So, because it's taking place in a different time. It may involve the same character of Danny Torrance and of Dick Halloran, but Stephen King is the thread.
Yeah.
That's the DNA stringing between it.
And just side note, really looking forward to Mike Flanagan's upcoming adaptation of The Dark Tower.
I'm looking forward to Mike Flanagan's.
Just end there. Yeah.
Fill in the blank.
Yeah, anything.
I'll watch anything he does.
Well, that's really awesome. So my first sequel is A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, directed by Chuck Russell in 1987. Now, I talked about the second installment, Freddy's Revenge, in our queer horror episode. And in that, I said, one of the things that bothered audiences about the movie, but it's something that later revisitings of the film and my own personal revisiting of the film has become a strength, in my opinion, was its deviation from the original. It was a wild subversion of expectations, which audiences don't always respond well to. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, I'm going to say this a bit ironically, I think largely succeeds because it is a return, quote unquote, to form. And by that I mean Wes Craven returns to write the script. Mm-hmm. Heather Langenkamp.
Again, you see that, the continuity.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the thing is, Freddy's Revenge, I think, would have been a much better film to do 3 or 4 movies in, or as a side project, like in the world of Freddy Krueger or something. But as the second movie, especially coming out after the first movie was such a smash sensation and had a twist ending, that just doomed it from the start. But Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Chuck Russell has made a couple of really great movies. This one that I'm talking about, he did the remake of the 80s version of The Blob with Kevin Dillon. That's actually really, really good. And some movies I can't quite explain, like The Mask. But he's also, you'll like this beloved co-host, he is also directing the upcoming reboot of Witchboard.
Oh my God, I love that movie.
I know you do.
Listen, I know it's not a great movie, but I love it.
Who says that?
I don't want to know who said it.
So, some of the successful elements of this movie, we have the return of Wes Craven, we have the return of Heather Langenkamp as Nancy Thompson, and the completion of her story. It's a logical evolution of her character. She becomes much more of she was a badass in the first movie, fighting Freddy and all of that, but she was a child.
Yeah.
In this movie,
a circumstantial badass.
Yeah, in this movie, she's, has a career, she's a grown woman, and she knows the threat.
It's the evolution of the final girl.
Yes, and she also has a very heroic completion to her story that is really satisfying and really fits the whole, heroic journey. We've also got a young Lawrence Fishburne, a young Patricia Arquette. It's a blast.
Oh, there's the Arquette mention.
There you go. And, it's also got the Wizard Master. So in this movie, basically what makes it successful, in my opinion, is, Wes Craven said what he wanted to do while completing Nancy Thompson's arc, he wanted to move the focus from a lone fighter against Freddy to a group of people banding together. So we've got these troubled teens in a psychiatric center who have been, all having nightmares about Freddy. And the action kicks off with one of the best parts of the movie, that severed tendon marionette suicide scene. It's not quite a suicide, but it's made to look that way. But in this movie, you see something for the first time is these teens, they start fighting back in dreams and using dreams to shape reality, the reality of the dream. So like the wizard master is, he's Will. In real life, he's a nerdy D&D introvert confined to a wheelchair, but in dreams, he's a wizard master.
Yeah. Shooting
his wheelchair with wizard master powers. And this comes up in later sequels, but it's a movie that I remember enjoying, and I actually recently rewatched it just to make sure I still really like it, and I do. It really holds up. It's very 80s.
Yeah,
it's very 80s.
It
I mean,
is.
Dokken does the theme song Dream Warriors. We are the Dream Warriors.
If you like Stranger Things, you should rewatch a lot of the Nightmare on Elm Streets.
Especially this one, because it's got, scrappy teens fighting evil, going through horrible things.
Yep.
Listen, the
this
violence
thing that exists on another plane that you can't quite get your handle on.
The effects in this movie are top notch. It introduces a few things that'll come into play in later films, like Hypnosil, which is mentioned a bunch of times in later films. It also, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because originally Wes Craven's his script was much darker, and Chuck Russell lightened it up a bit and added some humor that doesn't always quite hit, and that I see as sort of the beginning of the end, because in the later movies they start to get really sort of like slapstick, in their humor, and by Freddy 6 it's like just an absolute turd.
Yeah.
And then Wes Craven comes back in the 7th and rescues it again. But Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. Yeah, I think the Stranger Things comparison is really apt. The effects are really good. The deaths are gruesome and creative. Freddy's top of his game. And it's nice to see Heather Langenkamp back to finish up her character.
Yeah. My next is The Conjuring 2, which was directed by James Wan, who also directed the first Conjuring film. And he really, I think, made his big name with the original Saw movie.
Yeah, he directed the first Saw, which is very different from the sequels, and in my opinion, far and above the best one.
So The Conjuring 2 is, again, it has Juan behind the camera, but also it's a continuation of Ed and Lorraine Warren's paranormal
their case
investigations.
Files. Yeah, it's based on the Enfield poltergeist case file that they did do back in the 70s.
And so it has, the same visual aspect because it's the same director. It does have a different story, but again, that common thread of Ed and Lorraine Warren, played by Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga, is really where this story's strength comes from. And it's set in London, so it goes completely out of the United States. And this is actually they're all based on true stories, but this is also based on a true story where, similar to like the Amityville horror, this home in Enfield is supposedly demonically possessed.
Yeah, it was quite famous at the time for... It was a big media sensation, locally especially. And then when the Warrens got involved, that certainly upped its notoriety.
Yeah. Again, it takes place, single mother, has 4 children.
4 girls.
4 girls, all girls, the Hodgson family. And they start to notice disturbances, just as most of the Conjuring movies start off with that. And this actually starts with Lorraine Warren being so, I think this film starts with her being so like overcome with evil that she wants to quit.
Yeah, well, and
she wants
also,
to quit totally.
It introduces the sort of ticking clock element of every time she confronts this evil or uses her power, she endangers herself or she becomes weaker. And, her husband's very concerned about that. And there's that hero sacrifice of like, well, if I stop, people get hurt. If I keep going, I get hurt.
And it's where we're introduced to Valak, which is the demon.
The
nun.
That's the continuation of this, and that's what I think. It's what makes the sequel. Aside from the fact that it's just a bomb-ass movie. It's really good. It's scary. It's tight. It's awesome. It's like
and
the
it's
first
a timeline
one.
Continuation because the original Conjuring took place in the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
And this takes place in the very early 70s.
But it takes all those elements and it also introduces Valak being this sort of common thread which builds out the greater menace.
And it's
sort of
almost
the
as if
Conjuring's
Lorraine
Thanos.
Warren is carrying Valak with her.
Yes.
Yes.
And fans of the Conjureverse or whatever who have seen other installments will certainly recognize Valak, specifically in The Nun.
Yes.
It also introduced the what was it, like the Jangly Man? I
also think that this is a very successful sequel, again, because of the primary players in the film. It really is a progression of their relationship, their work, quote unquote work on, demonic.
For the purposes of this
exorcisms.
pod, let's just say it's all true.
Yeah, sure. But also, for people that love true crime, this is Conjuring Universe, I think, is a way to really scratch that itch.
Absolutely.
Because these are actual people.
And go through the Lorraine case files. I mean, they wrote a couple of books themselves.
Yeah.
And there are, some... listen,
It
the
adds
veracity of which
authenticity
I'm not
to the
going
story.
to get into, but it's an interesting read and it's flavor building for sure.
The authenticity of it, because they do have actual Ed and Lorraine Warren recordings that are present within
and they
both
were
films.
legitimately recognized by the Catholic Church.
Yep.
They were I have an opinion of them, but they were sanctioned to do what they did.
If they helped people feel better about their lives, then
it's complicated.
Yes.
I guess it's how you feel about palm readers who can quote unquote commune with the departed.
They're not going door to door.
But if they're
making
offering
these things up, they're going in response to they've tried everything and they're the experts that are called in.
And
finally.
if that brings peace to somebody, then that is a service.
Yeah, and honestly, only Lorraine Warren can speak to her abilities.
Well, not anymore. She can't.
No, or can she?
Lorraine. That's just the mutant we keep in the basement. Shut up down there.
So I also want to say that the Conjuring universe, the second installation did not disappoint because the first one was so well done and so scary. This one equally so.
I fully expected the second one to suck because the first one was I walked out of it going, oh, in 10 years from now, this will be referred to as a classic.
Yeah, it felt very much like they were pushing something that didn't need to be pushed. To your point earlier, does a sequel even need to be made? And maybe in this case it didn't, but there are many of the, Warren files that have come apart. And there's like this reset at the end of where they take that object and put it in their little spooky house museum.
Yeah.
And the vision of this approach to the entirety of the Conjuring universe that expands into The Nun and into
Annabelle and The Conjuring 3.
Yeah, so it's very much an intentionality to create this. This doesn't happen by accident.
I think that's another element of a successful sequel is you've planned this out. This was always meant to be a larger tale. That's usually a sign that, when you've thought ahead, not at the expense of the first movie. Like I mentioned, later Marvel movies feeling like largely just set up instead of movie first, set up later. This is a sequel that it works because it focuses while it does expand the mythology and the effects are bigger
Mm-hmm.
in this movie, it still keeps the setting pretty intimate. It
It's
focuses on a family. It
Yeah.
focuses on one location largely. It's got the same continuity of characters.
It's a build-up.
Yeah.
It doesn't start out with all these explosions.
But it's got enough different that it doesn't feel just like The Conjuring 1.5.
Yeah,
I love that movie, and I love that example.
me too.
And I wanna
I'm
go next.
I'll watch them all.
Same.
I'm fully involved in the Conjuring universe.
I'm in like 7 different universes
I'm
at this
conjuring
point.
another Conjuring.
Yeah. So my next movie is, so my first one was from 1987. My next one is from 1988 and is Hellbound Hellraiser 2.
Wow.
I love this movie. Now, a little bit of Richard trivia. This was the first movie I ever had to turn off because it was too gross.
A little Laura history is I've never watched a Hellraiser movie.
Not a single one?
No.
Okay.
I've seen enough moments
audience,
to piece together.
Pause
that
while
it's
we
not
go
for
watch
me.
11 movies in a row.
I mean, if you had to pause it because it's too gross,
I did take a few deep breaths, and then I made the decision, I have to watch this all the way through, and I'm glad I did. It was early on in my budding descent into madness and horrors. So I was still kind of a neophyte, and it's a hardcore movie. And the scene in question, for those who have seen it, involves the reincarnation of Julia. Now, here's some of the connective tissue. It's a new director, but it is someone who worked on the first movie, Tony Randall. And before you ask, no.
Not that one.
Not that one.
I mean, it depends on who's listening, because
Although, yeah, no, I got it. But
if
although
you're 40 or over, it's not that.
Felix Unger directing a Hellraiser movie, I think, is pretty hilarious. Either
Right.
just being like really fastidious about it, like, oh my God, there's blood everywhere.
Yeah, we have to clean this up.
Oh, your nipples.
See, that makes it even better.
Yeah, it does. So anyway, back to Hellbound. Now, this movie rules because it follows all of the things that make what we have established a successful sequel. We've got continuity in Clive Barker returns to write the script, not direct, but write the script. Tony Randall, who was involved in the original, comes to direct. We have Ashley Lawrence coming back to play Kirsty, the heroine from the first movie. It's a continuation of her story. It builds on the lore. We've got more background of the Hell Priest in Doug Bradley's Elliot, who is a World War I soldier before he becomes the Hell Priest. And not a nice person. So we've got the return of Claire Higgins' incredible villain, Julia, from the first movie. We've got the introduction of an amazing new villain in Dr. Channard, played by Kenneth Cranham, who is a absolutely vile monster in this movie and has a pretty cool comeuppance. So it's gory as hell. It's got just all those wonderful sadomasochistic BDSM Cenobite moments we all love and treasure. And like a good Hellraiser movie, those are done sparsely. It may surprise people who haven't seen the movies, but the Hell Priest, Pinhead, is not in a lot of the movie.
Right.
He's only in a few minutes of it, really.
Which makes him scarier.
Yes. It's the menace behind that
It's like
really makes
the
it
cult
scary.
leader that
Yeah.
is only whispered about.
Because he's the representative of hell itself. And there are other characters. There's the weird vagrant character that like eats bugs and, gets sucked into a pillar, but also opens the doorway to Leviathan. And then there's Leviathan, which is like an arch demon of hell. We meet all this stuff. It's an expansion of the original. It is the continuation and the completion of Kirsty's story, although Kirsty does show up in a later sequel. Every movie after this one, up until David Bruckner's remake last year, you could just skip. They're all bad. Point of interest is the 8th one, I think, was Scott Derrickson's first directorial debut. It's still not a good movie. A lot of these movies began life as scripts that had nothing to do with Hellraiser, and then the Weinsteins didn't want the rights to revert back to Clive Barker, so they kept farting out Hellraiser movie after Hellraiser movie. They would just take random scripts that weren't getting produced and rewrite them to include Cenobites, which is why they stink. So Hellbound does not, though. The second movie is so good. It's got a lot of callbacks to the original, but it very much does its own thing. It's bigger, it's bolder, it's bloodier. Andrew Robinson does not return, but his character kind of does. Even Frank Cotton returns. The band's back together, folks. And the chains with hooks on them are also back, going into bits and pieces all over the place, and places they really, really shouldn't go.
Yeah.
Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. Take some Tums and give it a watch.
Well, I won't be, but you guys
it's
can.
Gross, man. I don't know.
It's not for me. It's
I
okay.
think you might like the first one, though.
It's not for me. It's okay. I don't have to watch everything ever created.
Okay.
I have a life.
We are getting her to watch the first one, audience.
So my last sequel that I'm going to talk about is a fairly new entry into the horror genre is A Quiet Place Part 2.
Clever title.
I believe that this is a middle. This is
It
ultimately
is
a middling.
Well, there are actually two more coming out. There's
Yeah.
a side film directed by Michael Sarnofsky, who did the phenomenal Pig with Nicolas Cage.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a third one coming from Jim from The Office.
Yeah, which I think is going to be more of a prequel.
No, the side one is a prequel. The Michael
Yes.
Sarnofsky is like day one of the invasion. Lupita Nyong'o, I believe, is starring in it. Yeah, it's going to be rad.
Big fan.
And the third movie is more a continuation of the family from the first two films.
So
of
that's
Emily
like
Blunt.
this is in the middle to that.
Yes. Again, world building.
Yes. So writer-director John Krasinski comes back.
Who knew, by the way,
I know.
that John Krasinski, of all people, could direct like a kick-ass, terrifying bunch of horror movies.
This talent of his was just waiting.
Amazing. I love it. I maintain that the line between comedy and horror is razor thin.
Yeah. So it comes, we come back to the film. We do see a little of the early days at the beginning. So, John Krasinski's character doesn't make it in the first one.
He pops up in this one,
But he
though.
does pop up, but he is behind the camera the whole time. And you can tell it has the same vibe. It has the same, it basically picks up a couple of months later.
And the flashback doesn't overstay its welcome.
No.
It's quick, it sets the tone, and it gives you a little bit of flavor of the early days, because the first movie kept the invasion aspect of it very cryptic.
And it also gives you insight into the new characters that come in.
They're introduced only to you get a brief glimpse of them as normal people, and then you meet them several years into the apocalypse.
What's really interesting too about the flashback scene is the store that is so important in the original film, that how it looks
when it's not smashed up.
Yeah.
I know. There are some great callbacks. Again, like it pays respect to the original, and it continues the story in an organic, authentic way.
Yeah. Well, we continue with the Abbott family being the primary focus, with Emily Blunt playing Evelyn and her children, Marcus and Reagan, played by Millicent Simmons.
Oh, yeah.
Who is absolutely incredible. And then
a rising
baby,
star.
the new baby that was born in the first film.
Yeah.
Which adds such... Because these films do not have sound. There is very
not
little
if you want to
spoken,
live, they don't.
And, Reagan's character is deaf, so that's how they communicate with sign language anyway. So that even pares down the verbal communication aspect of this film. And having a baby, a pretty newborn baby, and how they protect that sound from emanating.
Oh, it's pretty hard to keep a baby quiet.
Well, they find a way.
I know, it's terrifying. And
so
also,
terrifying.
if not, the apocalypse would legit be child abuse.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It grossed like $250 million.
And these are not
And
expensive
it was
movies to make.
pandemic. It was pandemic movie.
Yeah, yeah.
And it introduces Cillian Murphy and
Jaimon Hounsou.
Jaimon Hounsou. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh God.
As new characters.
Now that he's a little older, he's got a little white in his beard.
Yep.
But he still hasn't really. That's the only sign that he's aged in 20 years.
Yeah. And I think that what is really effective about this sequel, the continuity, obviously, but also it hits the same high notes that the original. So it gives you all of that tension and that, there's like a slow movement of just survival and daily activity. Maybe they're not going, hundreds and hundreds of miles. Maybe they're going 1 mile throughout the entire movie, but how slow and deliberate everything needs to be.
And it shows the depth of the effect this invasion has had, because she travels a mere mile or two and it's an entirely different world.
Yes.
It also drip feeds its information at a very wonderful pace. You start to learn organically a little bit about other surviving humans. There's a really good line that I think Cillian Murphy says, something along the lines of no good people have survived this long.
Yeah.
But then
right.
you
the
do
you
meet
do.
a group of good people that have survived. You learn more about the alien invaders themselves and their...
And it's also the safety of the farmhouse was really the catalyst in the first film.
And a bit of a crutch.
Protecting that.
Yeah.
And
that's
this
gone now.
film starts essentially with what happens when that fortress is compromised.
They've also lost John Krasinski, who was the ultimate planner.
Yeah.
His character was amazing at plans, routines, and just
so they have
clever
to pick
ways.
Up his legacy.
Yeah.
They have to continue his paternal legacy of she has to protect the children, but she also has to find alliances,
which is really done
the piece that wasn't introduced in the first film, because
that's
it was
correct.
very, very minimal with any interactions with other people.
The only way they communicated was, I think, through lights.
Yes, correct.
But,
and then we see what happens to that communication.
That's really scary.
And all the fires.
Yes. The other thing I really like about this movie is, you mentioned the use of sign language. The fact that they already all know this because of their daughter's deafness, they have an advantage.
Yes.
So it takes a quote-unquote disability, turns it into an advantage, and then by the end of the first movie, and especially the end of the second movie, it becomes a straight-up weapon to use against the invaders.
It becomes
it can kill.
A tool.
Yeah. So it's just a great reframing of what most people would traditionally call a disability into an ability that is I thought it's done in a way that sends a very clear message, but never at the expense of plot. It happens organically, it happens naturally, and that's why it works. It's not forced.
And I think it can exercise, it does help to have the context of the first film, but you don't have to. I still think that this movie can exist with the flashback and just, a synopsis of the first one.
Yeah, but you should watch the first one because it's really good.
But this is a middle story, and it doesn't feel like it's unsaid, undone, but I will like to see it continue.
The actor who plays the young Abbott daughter, Millicent
Simmons.
She is deaf in real life and had a large contribution to the authentic use of ASL in the movie. She changed a few lines around to make them more realistic, to make them more authentic to how people really sign, because there's a difference.
Yeah, there's a shorthand with signing.
Exactly. Same
and
thing in
nicknames.
the spoken language.
Yeah, you don't spell their names out. You give them nicknames or signs that represent them.
It's like learning Spanish in high school. You basically learn the most formal way of addressing people. But if you ever try speaking to somebody that way, they're like, what's your problem?
Yeah.
You sound like an aristocratic
like you're wearing
robot.
a T-shirt that's blue? Okay.
Yeah. So just shout out. That is... To have that level of authentic representation really adds to the movie. And she was able, from her point of view, to make some of these elements better than they were.
Yeah.
Because only she understood. John Krasinski's not deaf, and he wrote a deaf character. So having a deaf actress play that gives insight into the world, and
But
she
it's
was in a
interesting-
position to say, that's not how that would really go.
It's interesting how we, as a society, expects people with disabilities to adapt to our society as is. And this really shows how parents that are, raising a deaf child have to integrate their needs into their
we now live in
everyday.
a world where making noise gets you killed.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just now realizing as I approach my final recommendation that all of mine are from the 80s.
Oh.
Sorry, but I'm doing it anyway. I'm going with Aliens, 1986, directed by James Cameron. Now I understand that I said earlier, bigger is not always better. And I'm coming at you with an example of literally every single thing being turned up to 11. Now, James Cameron, at this stage, is the undisputed king of blockbuster cinema. He's the creator of CGI. He has made more money than basically anyone in Hollywood. He has made some of the greatest action sci-fi movies of all time. He's also made Titanic. And he is amazing. But in 1986, he was a protege of Roger Corman, who had directed Piranha 2 and The Terminator. So he steps into Fox and says, this is the story. He pitches the movie by writing the word alien on a board and then a $sign right after it. And hence the movie is called Aliens. So,
Wow.
James Cameron came in and said, hey, this wildly successful Oscar-winning movie that you just released a few years ago, I'm going to do something that is completely different than that, using the same character. So he took what was a claustrophobic horror movie and turned it into a balls-to-the-wall action horror explosion extravaganza. Aliens is bigger in every way.
Yeah.
We go from one xenomorph to swarms of them and a brood mother
And
that
also
makes new
the
ones.
visual, the cinematic experience.
Yes,
is
it's
very
much bigger
polished.
budget. It's the direction. There are Ridley Scott and James Cameron are two very different directors with very different sensibilities. Notably, H.R. Giger did not return for this film because he was under contract for Poltergeist 2, but Stan Winston stepped in, which is why the effects are so good in this movie. It's because the man himself is doing them. Now, this movie is a really great representation of the kind of post-Vietnam War generation because you've got this overpowered butch military that shows up completely arrogant and dismissive of anything that they're heading into, loaded up with the most sophisticated weaponry, and they get their fucking asses chewed to them in the first 20 minutes of the movie. Most of them are dead. So one of the great strengths, it's got such great characters in this movie. Obviously, we've got Sigourney Weaver returning as Ellen Ripley. And
she called herself Rambolina.
Well, like any good sequel, she is deeply affected by the events of the first movie and what happened to her. And being lost in space for 50-something years and everyone she ever knew and loved, even her own daughter, growing old and dying. So we also find out that she had a daughter.
I meant that she called herself Rambolina because of all the
that's
stunts
the thing.
And how
The
much
first
she
movie,
practiced using the weaponry.
The first movie, she is very much just trying to survive.
Yeah.
She's using industrial equipment because they have no weaponry. She's crawling through tunnels. She's alone.
She's hiding. This is more of fighting.
In this movie,
confronting.
She's putting on a mecha loader suit, calling the alien broodmother a bitch, and fighting it hand to hand.
Yeah.
But it's not like that happens all at once, and it makes sense. Sigourney Weaver plays an enraged Ripley, someone who is having a post-traumatic stress response to what happened. She's having nightmares, horrible dreams of her being infected with an alien. And she's pissed about it, and she wants her life back. So she agrees to go on this mission with the very, very well-played creep monster Burke, played by Paul Reiser. Company man, who ends up very predictably betraying everybody. God, he does it so well.
He does that in Stranger Things well, too.
But he's like a good guy in Stranger Things, sort of.
He comes around-ish.
Yeah. He's very good at playing morally gray characters, and also he's very funny.
Yeah.
Love you, Paul Reiser. Any fans of Comedy Bang Bang, check out the one with Paul Reiser. It's a really, really good episode. Promoting other pods.
I loved Mad About You.
And I loved Beverly Hills Cop. So, anyway, Aliens. Now, it's an audacious movie because the first was a smash success, and the second could not possibly be more different in tone, in attitude, in message. It's bigger, it's badder, it's bombastic. It's also one of the
gooier.
Best sequels ever made. I'm not going to say it's better than the original because it's apples to oranges at this point, but it stands on equal footing. The sequels that come after vary in quality, but Aliens, the other thing that James Cameron did was he demanded that his then wife Galen Hurd be producer, and Fox was like, no.
I think he had lots of problems with the crew on this film.
Yeah, it was James Cameron, like a lot of auteurs, I believe, is likely a difficult person to work with. But boy, you can't deny that output.
Absolutely, that's awesome. I think that we've covered it.
Well, that's sequels, everybody, and we hope we left you with the impression that even though it's very easy to feel cynical about sequels,
cynical.
They are very...
you can definitely feel cynical.
They are very... They are very much worth a watch in certain occasions. Be discerning. Do your research. Definitely watch the movies we recommended because our taste is impeccable.
Just think, do they have a common thread? Is it a continuation? And does it do justice and homage to the original?
Yeah, or just, nowadays watch the trailer and have everything ruined for you in 90 seconds.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Trailers. What's happened to trailers?
I mean, I used to really love trailers.
Same.
I actually used to love watching trailers at the movie theater.
Watching
and now
trailers.
I have such trailer fatigue when I go to the movies.
Oh, well, now they show 15 of them, and it's okay, come on.
And the same ones over and over.
We legit went to see a movie that didn't start until 40 minutes later because of all the ads. 40 minutes? That's too much.
Yeah.
This has been Angry Old Man Pod.
Well, before we have another sequel of your
outburst,
your, running out on the porch in your boxers yelling at neighborhood kids.
And I'll do it again.
Let's say our adieu.
Bye, everybody.
See you next time.
Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Suspanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. We're standing right behind you.